All right, so for tonight's talk, we just kind of want to address the subject of the core. So two trains of thought here: direct core work and indirect core work. So depending upon who you talk to in this field, you'll have the camp of training the core directly might be a waste of time, or vice versa. And we all know kind of when we're addressing the core, we have our things of like stiffness and rigidity, force transfer, transmission, pliability, dynamic stabilization, rotation, anti-rotation, breathing, etc. So we just kind of want to address that and see what all our take is on the subject matter on do we train our core, how do we train our core, why do we train our core? So I'll kind of switch it over to you guys. I guess first kicking this off, Danny, what do you define as your core?
So obviously this is something I've talked about a lot over the last couple of years, but I think the first thing is like it's been a changing definition for me over the years.
Yeah,
I've always obviously gravitated towards the side of it's very much a part of the training process, and I really just don't understand this like belief that it's this mystical thing that requires a bunch of nuance and it does or doesn't exist. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's here. It's a part of movement, so it's another one that we just kind of get off the rails with. But to the point, if we're going to be technical about it, I would say to define the core as any muscle that attaches to or acts on the spine, the rib cage, or the pelvis. And then I would also just add on the fascia that envelops that same kind of trunk region. So we have our anterior and posterior slings, which run from shoulder to contralateral hip on the front side, on the back side, shoulder to contralateral hip, and then what's referred to as the lateral sling or lateral line, which is really just the collection of the lat, oblique, serratus, the abduction group, or the glute, smaller glutes on the outside of the hip, and then the adductors on the inside. But to the point with this, there's a certain functionality and there are certain things that we want to be able to see from the trunk, pillar, or core, irrespective of how you define it. It's involved in all sport because it's involved particularly in all contralateral based actions. So the first thing that we need to think about here is kind of the root of it, the spinal engine, right? So I always think, to the thoracolumbar junction, right? A very critical one where we need to be able to, in certain cases, have stiffness and rigidity at the spinal level to include all of the deep core muscles that envelop around the spine, your multifidi, your deep transverse, the deeper inner obliques. And these muscles are vital, largely in part because they're autonomic, right? They're like, if they react in fire prior to conscious movement occurring. So, you think about the role that plays in stability globally throughout the body and ability to bend, create, and then also accommodate torque and forces. Coming outward a little bit further, as you alluded to, right, we have rotation and anti-rotation, but I think the obliques are muscles that have also kind of been misapplied, so to speak, where when we think about the obliques, we just think about, side bending, and then, for those who are a little bit more informed, the roles in rotation. However, another vital function of obliques is their ability to contract and stabilize to produce a strong barrier for the rectus abdominis or the transverse to fire on the anterior side. And then there's also involvement in the relationship with the QL and the erector spinae on the back side. So case in point, that's a muscle that needs to be able to be very stiff and provide a lot of stability for optimal force transfer and dispersion. So I got a little bit more long-winded than I intended to, but I do think that the definition and like kind of our true representation of the core is important because there's this bullshit banter about, you get enough core training in your primary lifts, your compound lifts. And like, it's not true, man. Like they are involved in the movement, obviously, because it's involved in anything that you do regarding movement, but it's only being trained to support you in those movements,
right?
Not sprinting, jumping, cutting, deceleration, all these different things. So it's another one that we can't just tack it on and say, oh yeah, we get it enough here. Don't need to waste time on our own. I think it should be a conscious point for most people's training on a lot of different ways.
Right. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, couldn't you even argue that, it's kind of like newbie games? So in the beginning, sure, you're training your core through the compound lifts because you're just starting out. But as you, continue to do them for years and years, you need something else to really kind of re-stress and retrain that system.
Exactly.
And Nicole, how often do you see like someone's back squat and the core being like the weak chain?
Oh, vast majority of the time, back squat and front squat are the big ones.
And the biggest part of the tree is its trunk. Yeah. So truth to that, look at nature, I guess. But yeah, to that point too, like, everyone wants to keep back squatting, front squatting, and sure, like those specialized, or I guess those core movements are super important to athletic development, but, you do develop this, like, I guess, torso stiffness and rigidity. But then how many times do you see, like, there's one day you're just doing really fine on a back squat, it can be submaximal, and then your back just goes out, like, all of a sudden.
I've seen, we had one athlete who stood up from a front squat and it went immediately. And then we had another athlete who the first time it happened to her, she was literally unloading the bar.
Right. And then with back standing out, it's like, I'm sure their spine or their core isn't weak. However, they're only training one aspect of it, just to go straight up and down. So again, kind of a reason to train your core specifically.
Yeah.
I'd agree,
Yeah.
So, trying to bring some different points in that together here. So we've already established that it's something that's a part of the training process by default. We've already also established that it's been identified as the clear weak link in these movements or in certain movements. Mm-hmm. So if we discuss it as it is there, that's what I don't get about when people have these counterpoints of like, the core isn't real, it's not a real thing. And okay, so like, let me get a little deeper on that. So even the ones that are like, the core is a thing, but it's meant to resist movement, not produce movement. That population is the kind of the second phase or the second wave as I see it, where they recognize that the core is a thing, but they're just trying to basically truncate the crowd of sit-ups, crunches, and, flutter kicks.
Sexy.
Right? So I'll give you partial credit there. But even that is an incomplete statement, because if we think again back to that spinal engine, everything we're doing in a locomotive pattern is requiring tensegrity at the spine. Mm-hmm. Right. It's a counter rotation to all movement. Right. So there has to be an ability for the spine to create stiffness in certain places where needed on certain movements, but then equally be able to bend, rotate, flex, and extend in other areas. Mm-hmm. That in and of itself is fundamental core training. And there's nothing on the planet that can tell me that that's not an important necessity for sport and or general health.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, even like the literature on like your spinal engine, part of that theory is the legs and the rotational axis of even your hips. It's secondary to the spinal engine. It's not like it helps in the locomotion of your lower half to even, heel strike, mid foot, and then toe off. And those papers are coming out with, that kind of theory. And even from like a visual standpoint of like, so say everyone gives like the rectus kind of like shit for like, oh, it's a shit kind of abdominal muscle. But then if you think about it, the rectus kind of like flexes our trunk, and it's the same, well, not the exact same, but it's almost the same premise as like your hamstring flexes your knee or your bicep flexes your elbow. I mean, so why doesn't our rectus have like a huge muscle belly? It has all those like sulci. And I think with the sulci, it's like, from a visual standpoint on an anatomy chart, you have that for a reason, is to actually transmit the forces from the lower to the upper.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
So that's something to consider, especially when we're not even talking about like Ollie, strongman, or powerlifting.
And here's another one: contracting isometrically during hip flexion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? If we don't have a strong abdominal contraction during the dry phase of a sprint, or just any general hip flexion exercise, rather, then that contraction is more strenuous.
Right.
It has to work harder to go through that range of motion and or at that velocity if there's less abdominal contraction. So that's another one that's a big, big factor. And so, we need to have strong hip flexors, but we also need to consider the platform above that it's firing from.
Right. And if you talk about hip flexors, I mean, a lot of attachments on your lumbar spine.
A part of the core muscles. Yes. Exactly. Yeah, the psoas attaches on the front side of the L4, L5 region, or L3, L4, I believe. But in either case, making it absolutely a core muscle, because that synergy right there is sport in and of itself.
Right. And even like going back to sport, I mean, your hernias, your sports hernias, pubalgias. I mean, to the crowd that's like, oh, all that core training is kind of bullshit. And someone gets hurt with those specific injuries, what do they resort back to? Fucking core training. And it's like,
what is it? What is the root cause of a hernia?
I mean, a lot of shit.
But among them is a lack of ability to accommodate pressure.
Right.
Right. And I mean, so that again, in and of itself, is another thing that just gets dramatically overlooked. Is you have to be able to create and produce force, pressure, accommodate torque. These it just goes so far beyond flex, extend, frontal plane, sagittal plane,
Right. And then even like what you said, but that pressure kind of like, I guess that's not at a homeostatic level. I mean, the importance of breath in heavy lifts,
Yes.
having, breathing when you're doing a max effort kind of lift, that's important. I feel like sometimes that's even missed, it's overlooked when we're coaching people and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you have athletes who are so used to breathing and bracing a certain way, and eventually they just start going through the motions, and then they wonder why, as it gets heavier, they're not getting that same pressure built up as they used to, because they just kind of like, oh yeah, I know how to do this, and gloss it over.
Well, and what's another thing that's common among female weightlifters?
Incontinence. Yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's another one,
It's a big part
and
of
you
it.
can speak to that one too.
Yeah, well, not specifically the incontinence, but
You personally, but you're a coach.
but yes, yeah. I can speak to it more so from what I've learned from direct performance, actually, though, and like some of the women's health, looking at like the pelvic girdle and how that kind of connects and works with the diaphragm, and how that's really, they talk about, training those muscles in order to help improve things like that, because people don't know how to breathe correctly. And so those muscles aren't being engaged and contracted properly.
And then you're just destabilizing the entire system.
Mm-hmm.
We got a couple more minutes here. So, I think the next step to take on all this is to then start to think about the slings in particular, right?
Yep.
And the anterior and the posterior slings is something that we've been talking about since Conscious Core,
Mm-hmm.
Going way back. But with the slings, this is something that, again, I would consider to be the most organic sport pattern or dynamic human pattern that you can think of. So it's irrespective of whether or not you think that the fascia slings are a thing, make yourself happier by just thinking contralateral based movement, right? So a core exercise for me that I do often that is posterior sling focused is a single arm, single leg kettlebell row using a heavy band as my stability point, right? That's one of the best things that I've ever done to specifically light up that back line or that posterior sling. And you can just tell after movements like that, how that contributes to propulsion in your gait, the way that you're able to kind of get in and out of positions. Like you just start to notice differences in how you're moving.
Yeah. And I mean, like I've been getting like really into just, wrapping bands around someone. And then, I don't.
Full setup. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, you could get into whether this is indirect or direct, but going back to your slings, matching the setup with the particular sling, and then, starting proximal, working, kind of stiffness in a rotation. But then if you're going to, even like with a TKE, your one leg could, practice triple extension while one's holding an isometric triple flexion kind of stuff. So it's still just a basic sling pattern like the QB would do. But then I guess that would be more indirect core, but still training the core. And then at the end of the rehab session or workout, then train it directly. You know what I mean? So we're still getting some aspect of core all the time.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I guess just to add a quick addendum or note to that, like in the most basic way possible for those who aren't super informed on the fascial sling thing, the anterior fascia sling is a dead bug, right? Think about doing a dead bug. The posterior fascial sling, think about doing a bird dog. Those are the most elementary variations that you can do to isolate those or to emphasize them. But, to kind of conclude that whole point, a lot of what we're saying is there's times to specifically sit down and do isolated core work. But in most cases, it's just modifying your accessories a certain way or doing things slightly different in your warm-up movement prep. And then once in a while, tacking on concerted core movements. And then that's really all it takes. Like it's, we're not saying you need to do a 20-minute Pilates class and, a bunch of goofy Bosu ball exercises. Like it's just thinking more than it is nuance.
Right. And again, training the sections of your cores and slings you don't have. Because do some type of podcast, just recently, I kind of agreed with the statement. A lot of times people will just straight up go, you have a weak core. But then you tell that to someone who's squatting like twice his body weight. Is that really a weak core, or is he just not focusing on different aspects of that whole system?
Right.